You're watching Reuters TV. Here are your top stories.
Capitol Hill flirts with a government shutdown.
China calls for calm in tense political waters.
Here's a neat trick. Trump's cosmic call to congratulate one of NASA's finest.
This is Reuters Now.
It's another shutdown showdown on Capitol Hill, and for Donald Trump, the timing couldn't be worse.
I think we want to keep the government open. Don't you agree?
I'm Andy Sullivan in Washington, where Congress is yet again battling over the budget as a deadline approaches. We've seen this scenario more than a dozen times over the past few years. What's different now is that funding is due to run out right as Trump reaches the end of his first 100 days in office. The last thing anybody at the White House wants is to celebrate that milestone with a forced holiday for the federal government. As Congress returns from a 2-week recess on Tuesday, the government's already running on fumes, with only 4 days to pass a new funding bill and avert a shutdown of federal services, from food safety inspections to the national parks. Trump's Republicans control both chambers of Congress, but that doesn't make the task any easier. Democrats, whose votes are needed to pass the budget, are refusing to cooperate on any funding bill that would include money for Trump's signature wall along the Mexican border. They're also digging in their heels against any bill that would exclude funding for Planned Parenthood or the federal Obamacare subsidies, which remain in place until Republicans find a way to get rid of them. So unless the GOP can entice at least 8 Senate Democrats to support their funding bill, the government will stop dead in its tracks at midnight on Friday. Thousands of federal employees will be furloughed just as the nation takes stock of Trump's first 100 days in office. The White House and congressional leaders could decide to let this one go and fight another day with some sort of short-term extension of funding. That would make Democrats happy, but then the GOP leaders and Trump would face another potential rearguard revolt from House conservatives, the very same group that helped doom last month's attempt to push through a health care plan. So it's another high-wire moment for Trump and Congress. Leaders say they are making progress in their discussions to get a budget through, but until they actually get something passed, nobody in Washington will be breathing easy this week.
A busy night on the phone for Donald Trump on Sunday, the US president holding calls with Chinese leader Xi Jinping and Japan's Shinzo Abe about the situation with North Korea. Both Asian countries spoke about the calls on Monday morning, Abe with a message of support for Trump's no-holds-barred approach to dealing with Kim Jong-un.
I highly appreciated President Trump's stance to show in words and action that all options are on the table regarding North Korea.
But it was a different message from China, an increasingly worried Xi Jinping calling for all sides to show restraint. Reuters correspondent Christian Shepard explains why Beijing is worried the situation may spin out of control.
For one thing, China is the neighbor of North Korea and is likely to see a flood of refugees coming over the border should conflict break out. In another sense, there are a lot of geopolitical reasons why China would not want to be caught in a war between one of its allies and the United States. Then there is also the fact that this is under a new administration. They're unsure as to exactly how the Trump administration is likely to handle the situation. So these factors together make China increasingly concerned about the possible outbreak of war.
Adding to China's worries, a fleet of US warships is now just days away from the Korean peninsula, according to Vice President Mike Pence. At the weekend, Pyongyang said it was ready to sink the American aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson, before Japan announced it's sending 2 of its own destroyers to join the American fleet for military drills, and South Korea said it may also do the same. As America and its allies keep a wary eye on North Korea's next move, there are fears that some sort of weapons test could come as early as Tuesday, when Pyongyang celebrates 85 years of the North Korean army.
Emmanuel Macron's supporters not the only ones celebrating Monday. European equity markets soaring the day after the French presidential candidate won the first round of the election. Shares opening sharply higher and the euro briefly vaulting to 5-month peaks.
I'm Reuters reporter Kira Lee here in London, where investors are breathing a sigh of relief. They believe Frexit is now an unlikely possibility, but could they be celebrating too soon?
Sterling fell sharply against the euro, with investors piling back into the European currency. Pro-EU centrist Macron seemingly the market's favoured candidate, and now he's expected to beat right-wing rival Marine Le Pen in the deciding vote in a fortnight, easing concerns over her desire to pull Paris out of the EU. France's benchmark CAC 40 index up almost 4%, and bank stocks gaining more than 6%. That after Asia led the way higher earlier, Japan's Nikkei share average touching a 3-week high, and so-called safe haven trades were unwound. Gold, government bonds and the yen all taking a tumble as the appetite for riskier assets crept back in. Now investors will be hoping they didn't get ahead of themselves when France returns to the polls on the 7th of May.
The state of Arkansas set to execute 2 convicted prisoners Monday before one of the state's lethal injection drugs expires at the end of the month. The drug, midazolam, is one of 3 used by the state in capital punishment. It's meant to anesthetize the prisoner before 2 other drugs stop the heart and lungs. But Arkansas and other states have faced difficulty obtaining it as drug makers increasingly refuse to supply chemicals for execution. Moreover, midazolam's effectiveness has been questioned. In at least 2 cases, the drug seems to have failed, leaving inmates writhing in pain inside the death chamber. Arkansas announced plans to put 8 prisoners to death in just 11 days ahead of the drug's expiration at the end of April. Subsequent court appeals stayed 4 of those sentences. Last week, the state executed its first inmate in 12 years. On Monday, Jack Jones and Marcel Williams are set to die. Both men were convicted of separate rapes and murders in the 1990s. A rush of state and federal appeals are expected. But last week, the U.S. Supreme Court's newly seated Associate Justice Neil Gorsuch indicated he's inclined to side with the court's conservatives and uphold the state's right to execute prisoners under law.
You can go down the block and see black, 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 and then the green spot.
Florida residents are dealing with the aftermath of over 100 wildfires that have hit central and southwestern parts of their state as firefighters continue to contain the blaze. Charles Davison of Polk County wasn't sure if the firefighters would even make it.
There was a possibility that it wasn't going to get here in time. But they did, and they, as I say, it's amazing what they can do.
But for Anthony Alston of Fort Myers, he returned seeing some of his belongings charred.
4 boats and about 9 vehicles, but the house was still there. All of our animals were safe, and we were safe.
Rain on Saturday, along with the help of firefighters, contained some of the blaze that burned through nearly 30,000 acres in Florida. In Collier County, the 5,500-acre brush fire was 50% contained Sunday morning. Florida Governor Rick Scott said on Sunday that the brush fire in Lee County was believed to have been started by someone throwing out a cigarette butt in the dry weather. Scott added that the evacuation orders in Lee, Polk, and Collier counties have been lifted. But authorities warn of no rain but high winds and thunderstorms for Monday, which may keep pushing the blaze forward.
What we do every night is like something out of a strange dream, except that the next morning, it all makes sense.
Runoff of the French election. I'm Noah Barkin, special correspondent for Europe at Reuters here in Paris, following the French election. French voters gave Marine Le Pen over 20% support. She's in the second round of the election against Macron. Almost 45% of the vote went to candidates on the extremist fringes, on the left and right. So this is not a death knell for populism, but it is a sign that populists are having trouble breaking into government, into power. It's true that in the second round you have Emmanuel Macron, a former banker who wants the French to embrace globalization. He advocates business-friendly economic reforms. He's up against a far-right firebrand in Marine Le Pen, who has a France-first approach, who's very anti-Europe, potentially wants to take France out of the European Union. So the choice in the second round of the election is quite stark between this sort of globalist approach, if you will, and a more nationalist France-first approach. There is still a slight chance that Marine Le Pen could win if there are surprises over the next 2 weeks. Le Pen has made very clear that she's going to paint Macron as an elitist, disconnected banker. And that makes him vulnerable in the final weeks of the campaign. He made what many people are describing as a mistake last night by allowing himself to be filmed at a fancy French left bank restaurant celebrating with his friends. If he makes more mistakes like that, or if we have more attacks from Islamist extremists in France over the next 2 weeks in the run-up to the second round, this race could tighten. But Emmanuel Macron is still expected to win this regardless of what happens.
A major military shake-up in Afghanistan, Kabul's defence minister and army chief of staff quitting on Monday after the deadliest ever Taliban attack on a military base. The assault last Friday came just a week after Trump dropped his mother-of-all bombs on suspected ISIS fighters. Reuters' Josh Smith says the US now faces many questions over its role in the country.
American officials are here in Kabul trying to develop more of a strategy to work with Afghan officials, but some of those efforts have been thrown into doubt by recent major Taliban attack that killed more than 140 soldiers. And this security failure has now led to the resignation of top Afghan officials, including the defense minister, which again throws more doubt on American efforts to formulate a new strategy for Afghanistan.
US officials have acknowledged Afghanistan has rarely been a priority in recent years, as decision makers are increasingly consumed by Syria, Iraq, and now North Korea.
The world's leading drug companies may have found their next target, a disease that's on track to become the leading cause of liver transplants by 2020. As of today, as many as 15 million Americans are suffering from the condition clinically known as non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or NASH, and there are no approved treatments for it. Reuters correspondent Bill Burkrot.
Initially, most of the work in this field was being done by very small biotechs. And so what's happened now is the big pharma companies, the large drug makers, have realized this is going to be an enormous category. We're talking about, $20, $30 billion down the road.
With a huge pool of patients guaranteed for decades and many of the drugs in development still years from reaching the market, investors are buying shares in little-known drug companies working on NASH treatments, who may quickly become takeover targets.
When Novartis signed a $50 million collaboration deal with this little tiny company, Conatus, that's working on an end-stage drug that they hope will basically save people from transplants, that little company's stock went from a little under $2 to a little under $5. That's a big jump. When Allergan, which has decided to really get in the game, they bought a couple of companies. When they bought Tobira Therapeutics, Tobira's stock went from like under $5 to $33. Basically Allergan spent $1.7 billion on this.
And that's just the kind of equation investors and big pharma are playing for.
Do you hear me?
Yes, sir. We have you loud and clear.
And so began President Trump's call Monday to the International Space Station to congratulate NASA's Dr. Peggy Whitson for her record-breaking stay in space by an American astronaut.
534 days and counting.
Trump joined on the ground by daughter Ivanka, who chatted up the passage of the Inspire Act encouraging women to pursue aerospace careers, and astronaut Kate Rubins, the first to sequence DNA in space. Trump's cosmic call also coming roughly 1 month after he signed a $19.5 billion NASA bill to finance, among other things, a Mars exploration aimed for the 2030s. Dr. Whitson using the opportunity to explain some of the more delicate preparations for the multi-year trip.
Water is such a precious resource up here that we also are cleaning up our urine and making it drinkable, and it's really not as bad as it sounds.
Better you than me.
Trump also spoke with NASA astronaut Jack Fisher, who reminded us that in addition to a range of scientific pursuits in space,
it's also just cool.
Fisher showing off his colleague's classic anti-gravity trick, dubbing Whitson, quote, our resident space ninja.
You're up to date. Check back later as stories develop.